Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. We're just going to give it another minute while people are joining. People are joining pretty quickly, so we just want to give it another 30 seconds or so. Okay, I think we can get started with a little bit of background and housekeeping information. First of all, welcome to your dedicated group here on a Monday morning. So this is our third webinar in the AmBIENCE Webinar Series, third of three. So I will turn it over pretty soon to my consortium colleague, Lieven. But first, I think most people on the call are familiar with the Zoom platform. We will be doing a polling session on the Zoom platform, so stay tuned. The polling questions will open directly in your browser. And then we'll also be doing an open discussion at a certain point toward the end of the webinar. So during that time, you can feel free to write in your questions to the chat box, and I will either ask those, or feel free to raise your hand using your individual screen, and I will turn the floor over, myself or Lieven will turn the floor over to you, and so we can have a bit more of an interactive session with everyone on the call. So whichever you're more comfortable with, either writing into the chat box or raising your hand and doing a verbal intervention. Other than that, I think we are ready to get started, and I will turn it over to you, Lieven.
Thank you very much, Jessica, and good morning, everybody. So my name is Lieven Vanstraelen.
Sorry, Lieven, I forgot one important thing. The meeting is being recorded, so all of this will be available after about 24 hours later. Over to you now.
Okay, great. So thanks a lot. So Lieven Vanstraelen, I'm senior partner at Energinvest, and yes, we're active in the AmBIENCE project for almost a year now. And I'm really glad to share you some of the early learnings on the aspects of the business model and the business concept for our active building EPC concept as we go forward. So for this morning, I've foreseen a small introduction to the AmBIENCE project, but I'll go relatively quickly. I think most of you already familiar with that. Same for our active building EPC model itself. As Jessica pointed out, there will be a short participant poll as an intro before we dive into some of the activities that we have undertaken on the business concept and model. The first one being a desktop study that we performed, and I'm going to give you some insight into those learnings. Quite a comprehensive stakeholder survey with ultimately not that many participants, but I think the quality of the survey was really good. Probably also due to the coronavirus situation, which made it a bit difficult. But we'll also come back to that because you are also invited to participate in the stakeholder survey. Sorry for that. As well as some insight into a document we're developing, which is a business concept document, which inputs to the business model. Then we'll have some interactive session, as pointed out, also around 3 open questions, and I'll dig a little bit deeper into the opportunity for the active building EPC model. And then if there's still any questions left, I'm glad to answer those. So quickly on the AmBIENCE project, so our vision is really to reduce building emissions throughout the European Union and lower energy consumption in buildings, mainly by combining the electrification of heating with active control in those buildings. So it's the electrification that provides the key to the flexibility demand response that we want to exploit into those buildings. And while combining them also with renewable energy, reducing basically CO2 emissions. And the idea is, of course, to use demand response in a flexible way through variations either over day or intraday to reduce and use the electricity at the most appropriate time when the electricity is the most green, basically. That's the vision that we have. So combining electrification with active control, and doing that, of course, within the framework of energy performance contracting. So what are we really going to do, or what are we already starting doing in the project? The first is, of course, to extend the energy performance contracting model, now, which has been around for almost 25 or even 30 years, and certainly in Europe for over 15 years. So to extend that EPC model for realizing energy conservation measures with demand response value streams, and activate that flexibility. Also to go beyond maybe the traditional buildings that we see a lot with EPC. EPC is used mainly in public buildings, a little bit in commercial buildings, and in some cases in residential buildings, but mainly when there's multiple units that are being covered by a single owner, for example, in collective social housing, or in apartment buildings with multiple owners, but have a single management. But so here the idea was also to look at new types of buildings and also clusters of buildings, building communities, and so on. Also developing tools to forecast the value that we can get out of flexibility in the contracting phase of the EPC, where ESCOs, but also ESCO project facilitators need to be able to calculate the business case, and then combine that, of course, with the matching methodology for measurement and verification in a more operational phase. Validate the concept, the tools, but also the M&V methodology through 2 pilots, one in Portugal, one in Belgium, and then engage with various stakeholders, and these webinars are one way of doing that. Who will be the beneficiaries? It's both the environment and the society as a global, of course, the end customers, the consumers, both professional and residential. Also, of course, energy system stakeholders, DSOs, TSOs are very important in the value chain of flexibility, and we will be trying to link them up with ESCOs, energy service companies who are implementing today, let's say, more traditional EPCs, and whom we expect to embrace the active building EPC model, and maybe adapt it to their needs and their opportunities. So quickly, the idea of the active building EPC model, from the more classical one, where the ESCO is providing energy savings, energy efficiency measures to the customer. Here he is still doing that, but in addition to the efficiency measures, he's offering and valorizing this flexibility, making it more adaptable to the configuration of the building through smart building management, basically. And so on the right, you see the summary of the concept, extending energy performance guarantees to also include demand response services, and also see how can we guarantee, that's very important, how can we guarantee that flexibility, extending it to various buildings. You see a few examples there, and then extending it to groups or clusters of buildings and local energy communities. Okay, so that's what AmBIENCE is about, and I think we can now switch quickly to a small participant poll.
Great. So the first polling question.
Of course, okay. Yeah, go ahead, Jessica.
The first polling question is, what is the main activity of your company in relation to today's topic? So we'll leave this open for about 30 seconds while people have a chance to vote. Great. If you haven't had a chance to vote, get your votes in. We'll give it another couple of seconds. For people who recently just joined the call, we're just doing a quick voting session, so feel free to participate and vote. And it should be right on your screen. There are no links in the chat box. Okay, we'll end this polling session so people can see the results. So Lieven, if you want to say anything quickly about this before we go on to the next question. If not, we can automatically go to the next question. Okay. Here's the next question, so feel free to start voting. So this question, just to read out loud, how familiar are you with the demand response and flexibility in buildings? We'll give this one another 30 seconds. All right, we'll close this one and do a quick view of the results.
Okay, so this is interesting to see that most people on the webinar are either very familiar or quite familiar with, which is good.
Great,
maybe
and then we
also is a bit of a reflection of the previous question about who are participating. If we would have had, for example, more ESCOs, maybe they would have been less familiar.
And then the final polling question. Let's see. How important do you expect the AEPC model to become, active EPC model to become in your activities in the next 5 years? Great, we've got votes coming in. We'll leave it open another 30 seconds or so. All right, I'll go ahead and end this polling session. We can view the results quickly. So it's good. I mean, looks like there's quite a bit of optimism surrounding the active EPC model.
Yeah, Yeah, I think it also shows that also from the side of the organizations that are requesting such flexibility, that they do expect the buildings to be quite a significant contribution. Okay, great. Thank you very much for participating in our small poll.
All right, and back to the
Then
webinar.
we can move on with the presentation. Okay, so in terms of the activities that we did on the business concept and business model, as I said, first of all, we performed a desktop study. Of course, it was not a comprehensive desktop study, but we looked at different sources of material that we deemed interesting. One of them being the Novice project, which is also a Horizon 2020 project, which worked on some initial modeling also and research work around the combination of energy performance contracting and demand response. So they were kind of leading a little bit that research. We are going in the AmBIENCE project certainly more into details around the business models themselves. Also, I think that the measurement and verification aspects is something that's quite specific to our project. But still, they had some good information. And here you see the number of documents that we looked at, a lot of their own deliverables in their project, and the ones that we then selected because they were relevant to the aspects of identifying the key actors, which roles they are playing, and the business models that demand response and flexibility allow in energy performance contracting projects. Another quite important one, a little bit more technical, of course, is the EPC Annex 67 project and working group from the International Energy Agency. A lot of information available. And then some more commercial sources like DEXMA, Smart10 Group, and then some earlier work from a couple of years ago that I was involved in myself in the IEA DSM 4 Task 16 expert group working on energy performance contracting, innovative energy services, where we did some work. And then we did a specific research on various documents related to measurement and verification. So in total, we looked at about 87 documents that we scanned, eventually decided to focus on 25, and those 25 were analyzed in more detail and ended up in the results of the desktop study. So of course it's difficult to present all of the results, and also because the final report isn't finished yet, we're working on it. But you can see here in the following slides just a few examples and a few elements that we were able to identify through this desktop study. For example, from DEXMA, on the relationship of between ESCOs and aggregators that are of course quite important in our active building EPC concept, and where they presented different types of models of collaboration between those. And as we have a few aggregators around the table, I think that's for example the type of information that's also useful for them, but it's probably also useful for ESCOs trying to understand which relationship they can build with existing aggregators, or to which extent they can play themselves a role in this aggregation of demand response. And I'll come back to that later. For example, the Annex 67 documents were quite technical, but had also quite a lot of information on possible building models, possible business models. And these, for example, are 4 types of business models that Annex 67 identified. Buildings participating in implicit demand response via retailers. And so implicit meaning that it's really the price tariffs that the flexible price tariffs that are used basically as to trigger events in the buildings, whereas the explicit demand response is more on demand, on request by the DSOs or the TSOs. So again, the purpose is not to go into a lot of detail in what those business models really represent, but it shows you what is the type of information that we could identify and analyze further, as they will also end up in our deliverable on the desktop study. Quite a lot of interesting stuff also on MNV. As I said, a lot of documents. There has been a lot of work done, of course, in the United States on also standardizing these MNV models, as is the case, by the way, for classical EPC, the work done by EVO on, for example, the International Performance Measurement Verification Protocol. Again, here also the US, which has always been a pioneer in demand response, also led the way in identifying measurement and verification. Our work now is more going to focus on okay, which MNV protocols or which MNV models can we apply in specific cases, because that's always the case. You do a desktop study, you get a lot of information, but you don't necessarily get all the insight in which model to apply when, under which conditions, and that's of course important for us. But again, here on MNV, several standardized models exist for demand response, and we will see which ones we can use and apply to our specific cases in buildings, of course. And they will be mainly focused probably on the implicit demand response. Okay. The second task or activity around the business concept and modeling that we undertook was the stakeholder survey. So we surveyed a number of stakeholders. As I said, in the end, a little bit less than we had expected, but still the quality is quite okay. And we ended up with 22 stakeholders from 8 different countries. You see the countries over here. And so Portugal, Spain, Italy, Belgium, Denmark, Finland, Croatia, and Cyprus. We had 2 types of questionnaires that we used. One for the flexibility providers, mainly ESCOs. The one mainly from, or the second one from flex requesters, mainly demand side, distribution system operators, DSOs or TSOs. The aggregators, some cases we had aggregators, they had to choose themselves, but ended up either replying to the flex provider questionnaire or the flex requester questionnaire, depending on their point of view. So some, again, not comprehensive results, but some initial insights into the information. It's really a state, of course, of the art of current practices, as we did. At the end, of course, ask questions about their outlook for the future, but it's also for us to try to understand what is the current status of the usage of flexibility in relation with energy efficiency in buildings. And of course, we wanted to understand where most of them have projects. So these are the flex providers, so mainly the ESCOs. And then you see that it's mainly commercial and to some extent public buildings. Confirms a little bit what I said earlier. EPC, for example, energy performance contracting, is not used that much in residential buildings. We also try to understand to what extent today they are already doing, for example, the electrification that I mentioned earlier, replacing gas boilers by electrical appliances, mainly heat pumps, and how that does vary over several buildings. And there you see that in residential buildings, again, it's not done that much, and even in commercial buildings, it's only about 1/4 of the cases where up to 25 to 50% of they use today electrification through heat pumps. Although it's interesting to see that in a very small amount of ESCOs already do it almost systematically, where they replace up to even more than 75% of the cases they do such conservation measures. And then again, for the public buildings, again, it's starting to happen, but there's still quite a lot where it's not used at all or less than 25% of the cases. For active automated control, it's a bit different because that's the other important element if you want to do the APC model, where you see that particularly in commercial and public buildings, quite a lot of them use it at least in half of their projects, if not 75. So we can see active automated control being much more widely spread already. Then of course the question is, what has to be maybe added to that to allow for also managing the flexibility and the demand response? But at least that's quite encouraging. And then in terms of adding increasing storage, it's also an element of providing flexibility, particularly in combination with renewable energy, with PV solar panels on roofs, for example. There we see that again, it's not very common at all, which is not really surprising, but it is a little bit more common in commercial buildings. If, however, they decided to add storage up to now, where would that happen? Well, then it's mainly batteries and hot water vessels, so it's more storing of heat. And we see that also electrical vehicle charging installations are being added. So different technologies are being used. To the extent that they use active automated control, what was the driving factor? There we see that there's two elements. It's mainly more energy savings and more cost savings, which are often the drivers for EPC, particularly in those commercial buildings that are being used, and to a lesser extent, but still the drivers of CO2 savings and comfort, improved comfort, are also relatively important. Okay, so no strong drivers that are more present or not at all present in this case. And then if we look at which type of technology they implement the active and automated control, and how frequently is it then we see that it's mainly heating, cooling, ventilation, and of course lighting that are most frequently used in combination with active control. But we also know today that lighting is not really a big source of flexibility in buildings. So we will probably be looking at electrical heating and then cooling and ventilation. There's a few others like compressed air that are already relatively common to be used. And then, for example, the storage or the screens or blinds much less. Okay, so it's more or less in line with our expectations, but it's good to see that confirmed. Okay, and then a table on the business cases, some different usages of dynamic tariffs, or different injection and consumption tariffs or capacity tariffs, where we asked, okay, which positive business cases are possible according to them, again in buildings, this is not related to industry, it's about buildings. And then we see that most of them see all of the business cases or the tariff structures being but then if we ask if they're making use of it, then we see that the vast majority is not using it today. So which does indicate a certain gap between what would be possible and what is being currently done. But then asking whether this business case could be possible for them in the next 3 to 5 years, then again we see a vast majority confirming that would be the case, or that could at least be the case. A little bit less for capacity tariffs, but certainly for the two others. And also indicating whether it's today in a pilot or a commercial phase. So it shows that only a few of them are using it. In terms of explicit demand response, we see a little bit similar trend. I see that, so you see that also there the positive business case is possible for a majority, but almost none of them are using it today. And again, a vast majority thinks that it could be possible in the next couple of years. Okay. And then a few insights on the first results from the survey from the Flex requesters, whether they would be interested in using flexible. So now we're talking about the network side of the ecosystem, whether they would be interested in using that flexibility from buildings, if it would be ready to use, meaning it fits their technical requirements. And there the answer is very clear. All of them are interested in using that. So that's also quite positive for our case. What would be the main criteria in terms of this ready to useness? And there we see that mainly reliability, but also to quite an extent aggregability, so the capacity to aggregate it, the capacity to settle it, and then the technical standardization are important. And they didn't suggest any other criteria. So again, no strong drivers, much stronger than the others. Maybe reliability a little bit more. How often would they need it? There it's clearly that the majority it's on a daily basis. So it's not something to do just once every now and then. Some of them weekly, and only a few of them, of course, are more occasionally. So, but most of the Flex requesters apparently would prefer to have it on a daily basis. And then the question whether it would help if buildings themselves provide information on their planned flexibility to facilitate their decisions. Again, majority of Flex requesters are clearly affirmative in that sense. We also wanted to understand, of course, if they're already making use of it. And again, it's a limited amount, a very limited amount of organizations who are already doing it. And we see also that it's mainly on a pilot level. So we're not yet in a commercial rollout phase for most of them, which also explains why we are working on these models, of course. And to the extent that they are considering or planning to make use of flexibility, will this be on a pilot or a commercial? There are also the ones who are not doing it yet are thinking about using it in a pilot. So it's probably still too soon to think about it in a commercial way. But if they want to do this pilot, then we see that about 1/3 is planning it in the next year. And the rest is doing it in the next 3 years. So we do see that the time frame of the next 1, 2, 3 years for developing the first pilots in this area. So that was it about the survey. So together with the desktop study, an important element of one of the key deliverables in this task. We are then working on a business concept document, which was already well advanced, and that will maybe continue to evolve a little bit as we get new insight also from these two studies. One of the things we've worked on, for example, is to clarify the energy services value chain in light of this new development. And this, for example, is a summary of a value chain as we also worked on it or defined it back in let's say around 2006, 2007 within task 16 on energy services, on EPC contracting. Where you see basically from primary energy through secondary or final energy delivered to the building, then the useful energy that is being delivered often in energy services through so-called energy supply contracting, as you're delivering useful energy, being heat, cold, compressed air, whatever, to the building. And then you have the energy savings and the energy efficiency delivered through energy performance contracts. So in supply contracting, you deliver or you focus on the demand side of the energy delivered to the building, whereas sorry, on the supply side, of course, delivered to the building, whereas in the EPC you're focusing on reducing the demand for energy. And all of those are, of course, representing business models. And so what we have tried to do is extend that by introducing an additional layer of into the value chain of delivery of demand response, of flexibility with flexible watt hours, representing this new business model of active building EPC. So it's like an extension of the existing value chain. We did also some work on the roles of different actors and building on the work that Novice did, and trying to understand who can interact with whom. So this is the more traditional view on the market, where ESCOs deliver their energy efficiency services on the left side, and may provide financing through financial institutions or investment funds, whatever. And on the right side, you have aggregators providing flexibility to demand side, sorry, to DSOs and TSOs. Whereas in the model that we're proposing, again, which is an evolution of the model proposed by our colleagues from Novice, is where we see the ESCO, of course, providing energy efficiency to its building customers. Doing that not just for one customer, one building, but doing it for customers having multiple buildings. So there is already a first level of aggregation, or what we call pooling, in fact, or clustering. But also, of course, those ESCOs have multiple customers, which can be pooled together. Themselves thus becoming what we would see as a technical aggregator of flexibility in buildings, that can deliver that then to the DSOs, to the flex requesters, either directly or through the current or future market aggregators. So it's kind of splitting a little bit this role of aggregation, incorporating the new role of ESCOs as flex providers. Okay. And then we had a look also at, for example, which building segments would be useful for EPC to be developed, understanding where there is potential for EPC today, and where is there potential for flexibility in those buildings. And there you see that, that there's today only a limited amount of segments where both potential for EPC and the potential for flexibility is relatively good. In some cases, EPC potential is quite high, but there's little flexibility for little potential for flexibility, or the other way around. And so we see that public and commercial buildings are probably still the ones that are going to be the first in using this APC model. Okay. Voilà. So then, as we come to the interactive session, the idea is to also to ask you some questions, and see who is interested in providing his insights into these. So maybe start with the first question. Whether you see any market failures, we're really talking at the level of the market, how the market works, any market failures that would need to be addressed to effectively initiate and develop a flexibility-enabled EPC market in your country. So as Jessica pointed out, feel free to, of course, to reply through the chat, and I think she will read out the responses, or I can. Or you can also raise your hand and react directly to them.
So as Lieven said, feel free to raise your hand and we'll give you the floor, or write in the chat box.
And of course, if you know, if you do not see any specific market failures, then I probably can also go to one of the following questions. It will give you maybe a little bit more time if you plan to. You want to react to this first question on the market failures. And if you want to raise your hand, you can do that on the. I think it's on the on the lower left side of the participant screen, right, Jessica?
Yes, that's right. Okay, so we got a question from the chat box. Usually customers do not believe in free of charge works done for them. They think somewhere they're being cheated.
Yeah. I guess the person, Mr. Balracci, is also referring to the EPC model in general, where there is this general idea that an ESCO goes in and says, okay, I'm going to save you, it's not going to cost you anything. We'll save you energy, and you just pay us out of the savings, and that's an easy win. And it's true that that's a model that sometimes is put in the market this way. It's probably not the right way to sell EPC, but it's true that does create some of a distrust sometimes on EPC. But I guess that's something for ESCOs and also for ESCO project facilitators in general to work on. I'm not sure it's a structural market failure. I think it's more of a failure of people trying to understand what EPC is all about. And in the end, it is, of course, investments have to be paid for. I think it's also important for ESCOs and other actors, but also for project facilitators, to emphasize the fact that they're in control about what they want to be done. It's up to the customer to fix the ambition level. And that ambition level can be high, that ambition level can be low, but it's up to the ESCO to decide, up to the customer to decide, first of all, what his ambition level is. And then, of course, you have to give the ESCOs certain level of creativity to propose measures that meet those ambition levels and meet those criteria. Certainly, making it appear as something that's free of charge and doesn't cost you anything is not a good way to sell EPC. I fully agree. And as we add flexibility to EPC models, that doesn't change. On the contrary, we're maybe adding even a little bit more complexity. We're also offering more opportunity, but it's not because tariffs are variable in time, and that allows for valorization of this flexibility, and that we should present it as being something that's free of charge. Okay, maybe let's go to the next question. For those of you who are already offering flexibility in combination with energy performance contracting, although I guess it's probably limited, as we've seen also from our survey results. But if you are, or certainly what are seriously envisaging it, what triggered it? What is it that led you to go for a flexibility in line with EPC? If you're not, which may be more the case, what is hindering you today from doing so? Is it the tariff structure? Is it the business case? What is hindering you? I see also that Mr. Balracci replied on the previous question. Since revenues for ESCOs come from savings and ESCOs are measuring savings, the customers see a problem. Okay, yeah, that's more related to the fact that that ESCOs may be promising, for example, 20 or 35% savings, and then in terms of doing the measurement verification, it's also the ESCO that may create a conflict of interest. I guess that's what Mr. Balrachi is referring to. Well, the thing is, you should use, of course, first of all, an independent and transparent measurement and verification plan. And that's why, for example, IP-MVP is being used in classical EPC. So that's the first way of doing it, is making it compatible with generally accepted standards. Still even better is to use an independent MNV professional, how we call it, a certified MNV professional, not necessarily to do the measurement and verification, but at least to verify it and to validate it. And that independent role can be very important, particularly if there is some mistrust from the customer. So this independent way of doing measurement and verification, in general in EPC, but also here in our active building EPC, can be a good way of avoiding that potential conflict of interest may exist between the ESCO, with the ESCO who is doing both the guarantees and the calculation of the savings. Okay, so let's go back to the second question. If you're using flexibility, what triggered it? If you're not, what is hindering you? Again, you can always reply through the chat box, or you can raise your hand. Let me make it. Wait another 10-15 seconds before we go to the last question. Okay, so let me just go to the last question. And anyway, if you want to still reply to the second one, that's no problem, of course. So in which specific segments of the building market do you see the most potential? I showed this table where, based on the analysis of where was the most potential for EPC or for flexibility in buildings. And we would be interesting, and I would be interesting to seeing if you also see more segments or specific segments with more potential for EPC. Are those the ones that we identify, or do you see, because of your activities, that there's also potential in, for example, residential buildings or others? And to what extent that may even differ from current segments? This, of course, is more of a question also to ESCOs. So I don't know if in the meantime we have some ESCOs on board. If we do, we ourselves in the project, for example, we are looking at, for example, social housing, where you do large-scale renovation of social houses. This can be collective social houses, but also residential neighborhoods with social housing, where you have like 50 or 100 relatively identical buildings. It's a bit the model that is used in projects like Energisprong or Renovate, for example, where you can combine integrated solar PV panels on the roofs with the replacement of existing gas boilers by heat pumps, and then maybe even with a battery at a neighborhood level. That type of model, we also think there could be interesting potential for flexibility in combination with performance. We have an answer coming from Anik from Vito, who's also working within the consortium. Industry is more focusing on own business and will have less problems outsourcing than residentials that want to keep their home. So I guess industry is in the lead here. Well, that's an interesting comment, of course, Anik, because industry is certainly in lead today. If we look at demand response, that's where most of the potential is today. But on the other hand, we see that EPC is not very common in industry, as the table showed. So that's an interesting case, is to see where whether industrial customers who are to some extent already working with ESCOs for certain measures, but not necessarily in an EPC model with performance guarantees, whether that could be maybe an alternative or a boost, in fact, for using also EPC in those industry applications. When we talk about industry, we always have to also distinguish between what is the process-related energy consumption, and that is often done in-house, not so much by ESCOs. And then is the peripheral energy, the heating of the spaces, even in logistics or industrial environments, the cooling, ventilation. That is more likely, of course, to be used with EPC. But even in that case, we don't see it as much as in, for example, public buildings or commercial buildings. But so yeah, interesting to see whether industry, as they have good potential for demand response, can also take an active part in the active EPC model. Okay, good. I suggest we keep it at this for the interactive questions. And then I have one more slide on trying to understand what was also the purpose of this webinar, what would be the opportunity to develop active building EPCs. And of course, it comes back to the different stakeholders that we identified. And again, I didn't focus here on the aggregators because they're a natural part already of the value chain. But it will also be a challenge, of course, for them to understand how can they move forward with this model in relation to ESCOs. But so the drivers of the development probably in the market are going to be either ESCOs, EPC project facilitators, who are often smaller companies, but they play a very active role commercially to get customers actively involved in EPC, and then the DSOs, TSOs, who are on the side of the flex requesters. So ESCOs, first of all, is improving the business case for EPC in buildings, and that's probably one of the important things we're trying to do in the AmBIENCE project, is to understand, okay, can this EPC business case be improved by adding demand response? To what extent, under which conditions, under which tariff schemes? But that's at least the promise and the case that we have to investigate. How can we improve that business case? Creating for them, of course, business opportunities, both with new customers, but also existing customers. And an ESCO who is already offering services to commercial buildings, does it make sense to go also into public buildings, or vice versa? Or, for example, the industry, as Annick pointed out. And which new role can they play in the aggregation value chain, as I showed you, becoming a kind of a technical aggregator, working in close relationship with market aggregators, working in relationship with these DSOs. The EPC project facilitators themselves, and they are often the ones that are accompanying customers, particularly in the public sector, maybe a little bit less in the commercial sector, because public customers have to go through public tendering, and they just often do not know, and therefore use project facilitators to help them. For them, of course, again, it's also convincing end customers and investors of alternative revenue models. Also those investors, the financial institutions, the investment funds, but also the public financing facilities have to become more familiar with flexibility in EPC to do this type of ESCO financing. What plays there, for example, with the public sector is a lot of questions around off-balance financing, debt-free or ESR neutral financing. For them, of course, exploring new advisory services that explore that flexibility potential and adapt their existing business models and their tendering models, particularly the tendering models, to include the active building EPC model. Then DSOs, TSOs on the other side of the value chain unlock the untapped potential of flexibility in buildings. And as we saw from the from the stakeholder survey, They really believe that there is a lot of potential in that building sector. But then it's see how can they work together with the other market actors to unleash that potential. Develop, of course, new relations with ESCOs. Some ESCOs are part of groups that are themselves electricity providers, so they may have already a good relationship with the electricity system part of the market. For others, that's much less the case. But that's certainly where those new relationships would need to be developed. And of course, the ultimate goal for them also is improve electricity network resilience. And I think they will also be interested in seeing how we can add performance guarantees to that flexibility in buildings, in addition to the performance guarantees that are today offered on energy efficiency in classical EPC models. Voilà. So I think with this we came almost to the end of the webinar, but there's still some room for other questions. I cannot guarantee I'll be able to answer to all of them, but I'll certainly do my best if anybody else has any other questions. So you can ask them through the chat box. And in the meantime, as you know, some of you may still have a question, I wanted also to invite everybody who is on the webinar to still complete the survey. So as I said, the results I showed you were for all of the surveys that we already received. But you still have the possibility, of course, to participate in the survey. Just go through the website. In the section on scientific communications, you can download the either the Flex requester or the Flex provider questionnaire, complete it, and then return it to us by email at info@ambienceproject.eu. So unless there's any, I think I saw one question coming through, maybe.
I think it was in response to the industry section. Not really even industry can be addressed with EPC.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's what I said. It's not impossible, and there are cases of industry of EPCs and ESCOs delivering services to industry through EPC. But as I said, in most of the cases, it's peripheral energy and not the one that's in the core industrial processes, where probably there is the most potential for flexibility. But again, that's part of our investigations. And if an industrial site has parts of energy that more act as buildings, as you would have, then it's the same potential and the same question that we would have in for example, commercial buildings. The real issue there is then that often that part of the building and that peripheral energy only represents a few percentages of the total energy consumption of the site. And more than 95% is really related to the industrial processes, which means that it's very often not very high on the agenda. So it's not so much a technical or even a commercial issue. It's just more an issue of priorities. People prefer them to focus, and rightly so, focus on this 95% of energy consumption. Okay, then we have another question from Mrs. Cheng. I'm sorry, I had to join the webinar late. Actors on both sides of the value chain are really confusing to me, coming from an innovation angle. Do you know of a reference that I can consult to understand the role of existing and potential actors? Yeah, well, the value chain that I showed where we proposed an extension is a value chain that was developed within IEA Task 16 on innovative energy services. So it's really related to energy services. In the deliverable that we will be publishing relatively soon, which is deliverable 1.2 of our project, which combines both the results of the desktop study and the survey. So in the part on the desktop study, there are several documents that provide insight in the role of different actors and stakeholders, and both the EPC, I think, and the DEXMA deliverables do so. But if you send me an email, Mrs. Cheng, and you have my coordinates on the first page of the webinar presentation, which you should be getting, then I can certainly send you an overview of the specific documents that we looked at and that we analyzed, and that go more into detail on the different stakeholders and actors in the value chain and in the demand response ecosystem. So feel free to send me an email. Okay. All right. So unless somebody else still has a question, then I think we can come to a conclusion here and end the webinar. Jessica?
Great. Yeah, sounds good. Thank you all for joining, and you have our contact information, so please let us know if you have any follow-up questions. And as I mentioned, this webinar was recorded, so we will be sharing that as well. Other than that, we'll say goodbye and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.